So now I'm just going to give you one announcement about something happening in the future, which is that the next of these sessions, if you want to make a note, is Monday the 25th. There you are. It's just gone into the chat. Monday the 25th of January. And that's going to be about the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which is something Extinction Rebellion's been strongly supporting. That's a date for your diary. That's also a Monday at 7. And now we're going to get on with this evening's session. So we're talking about citizens' assemblies and what sort of democracy, what sort of democratic instruments we can use to do what we're trying to do in dealing with the climate emergency and pursuing climate justice along with social justice, right? So this has been a demand of Extinction Rebellion from the start, that the government should set up citizens' assemblies. So that begs questions about exactly what these are and how they might work. So the first speaker is going to be Kathy Conn. She's a member of Extinction Rebellion up in Camden, has also been involved with Transition Towns, and she's part of a working group in Extinction Rebellion that focuses on this issue. After that, we're going to have, and we're delighted to have with us, Elena Carroll, who's phoning in or connecting in to this meeting from Dublin. She was active. First of all, she works at the University of Maynooth. She's a researcher on social movements, and she was active in the campaign which led up to the fantastic achievement in Ireland of the constitutional changes which basically legalized abortion in 2018. And that campaign involved a lot of different methods, including the use of citizens' assemblies. So enough from me. My name's Simon Pirani. I'm going to be chairing. But enough from me. Kathy, great to have you here. The floor is yours. Off you go.
Right, I'm just going to screen share. Can you all see? Good, because sometimes it doesn't work. And I'll just go full screen. Whoops. Oh, doesn't seem to go full screen on here.
We can see you fine. We can see the slide fine.
Oh, you can see it fine. Okay, you normally I do it for full screen. Okay, hi. Anyway, it's great to be here. I'm always happy to talk about citizens' assemblies. And I think, I mean, what makes Extinction Rebellion unique in the climate and activist movements is that we're not proposing the solutions. We want people from all walks of life to come together in a citizens' assembly and for together to propose the solutions to the absolute emergency that we are in. Okay, so here we have two photos of decision making. We've got decision making as we have it, and we've got an example. It's actually the Irish Citizens' Assembly as we'd like them to be. If you look on the left-hand side, you might very well think that this was recently taken and that the MPs are socially distancing. But in fact, it was taken in 2018. It was after the hottest February on record. It was the first climate debate in 2 years, and 40 out of the 650 elected representatives attended. So that's really an indication of the level of interest. And this is a topic that, that has been known about, the seriousness and the increasing seriousness for over 40 years. As you can see, they're facing each other. It's very oppositional. They're looking to score points and to win. On the other hand, we have citizen representatives who come together to find solutions, not to win. And they're sitting around tables in small groups with a trained facilitator. They're listening and talking and communicating with each other in a collaborative manner that ends up bringing about better decisions. Right, I'm going to give you a quick overview of how a citizens' assembly works. It has to be commissioned by government and run by an independent organisation. The member selection is done on a random basis, similar to a UK jury duty, but it's a real cross-section of the population, including everyone living in the UK. You don't have to be a citizen. And the 100 to 200 people will likely to be selected will be a mini UK with a mix of male, female, city, country, age groups, disability, education and social class represented in the mini public who come together. They come together and there's a period of learning where they hear speakers familiar with the topic, including scientists and people impacted. For example, you might have somebody from Fairburn, which is a town that's going to be decommissioned because of the rising seawater. Before these sessions of learning, though, the Assembly members receive training in critical thinking and hidden bias. And it's really essential that presentations are fair, balanced and diverse. Submissions. Further along the line, the broader public should be able to feed into topics or issues that they'd like the Assembly to think about. And they're usually collated by someone and presented to the public. I know that in the Irish Assembly on abortion, I think they received over 12,000, whereas in their Climate Assembly, which they had as well, they received something like 1,800. So it was quite interesting to see at that moment in time the interest. They then break into small groups, about 8 to 12 people, discussing what they've heard, how it impacts them and their community. They listen to each other, they deliberate and find common ground in the best interest of everyone. Each group has a trained facilitator who makes sure everyone's voice is heard and no one controls the discussion. Then the Assembly draft and vote on the recommendations and produce a report which includes reasons backing the recommendation and also includes a summary of the different views, that were expressed. Implementation. Before the starting the Assembly, it should have been made clear what the government will do with the Assembly's recommendations. Extinction Rebellion is proposing that the government commits to implementing all those recommendations with over 80% of the Assembly members' recommendations, and then reporting on any that they reject or modify. Right, okay, so if we go over here, you can see a map of the world, and this shows the deliberative democratic processes that are happening or have happened all over the world. It's not something new or invented by Extinction Rebellion, but these are not all citizens' assemblies. There are sort of quite a variety of different democratic deliberative processes. One I'll just mention very quickly was the French Citizens' Assembly, which was on the climate, which was to cut, the question they were deliberating on was to cut carbon emissions by 40% before 2030 while maintaining social justice. It was considered to be, was a brilliant pioneering effort, but hasn't quite come out as hoped for, as you'll hear in just a minute. But the social justice element was in there because the Citizens' Assembly really came about as a result of the Gilets jaunes movement in France. It cost €5 million or more. There were 150 representatives, and it went on for 6 long weekends, but it was extended to 7 at the request of the members when they the representatives when they realised the enormity of the issues. And they expanded the mandate. A citizens' assembly shouldn't be too controlled. It should be able to expand as the learning together develops. And they expanded the mandate to include biodiversity and public health related to food. They came up with 149 recommendations, including, quite extraordinarily, ecocide law. Macron had said from the beginning that, I forgot to mention this, he said from the beginning that any recommendations would be implemented without filter by either direct regulation, a bill to Parliament, or referendum. In the event, things are going on at the moment, and the French government is saying that 51 out of the 149 are already implemented, whereas the citizen representatives who, after the Citizens' Assembly, formed a group, they call themselves the 150, and they're monitoring what the government is doing, and they actually disagree, and there's some sort of contentious things going on at the moment. So, citizens' assemblies, they're thinking about themselves, their families, their communities. They're not thinking about their careers as our elected politicians are, or being re-elected. They can break deadlock on difficult topics because they have nothing to lose. And you will hear from Aileen shortly how in Ireland the Citizens' Assembly helped break the deadlock over abortion. And they're representative. If I heard the same evidence and talked with others, I would have come to a similar decision. The goal is not to hear what people think, but to have thoughtful, honest conversations and exchanges with people that you wouldn't normally meet. They're transparent. All the organisation, the materials, the slides, the presentations are live streamed and available online afterwards for everyone to see. So the members gain a real understanding of the issues. They work alongside government and supports it with a more democratic process to determine what should be done. And one of the sort of really important elements of a citizens' assembly is the collective intelligence. Studies have shown that the problem-solving capability of deliberative assembly is not down to each of the ability of the individual members, but it's a result of the diversity of the group. There's a diversity of views and ways of thinking, of insight and experience, which is actually absent in elected assemblies, in the Houses of Parliament, where a more homogenous group are actually making the decisions. Right, I'm going to finish off with, I hope Pierre is ready. It's quite difficult to imagine the impact that people from different walks of life coming together can have on the individuals involved, and how coming out of our bubbles can really change the way we see things. So we're just going to watch a clip that gives a sense of what it's like. I hope.
In the heart of Texas.
Last table on your left, they will check you in.
A little bit more serious, that's beautiful. Yeah, there, that's great.
526 Americans gathering.
I love this. Great, thank you so much.
Upset about the partisan divide.
Let's be real.
This is an experiment, a scientific sample.
Oh dear.
Okay, we're frozen for a second. talk among yourselves. There we go.
You are going to listen to other people whom you never ordinarily would encounter.
Reflecting who votes on Election Day.
Hey, how are you?
It's a 4-day in-person poll called America in One Room. Before arriving, this group took one poll on the major issues in the 2020 election. Here,
it's a great question.
They listened to candidates, to experts.
This is really your time to have your voice heard.
And break into randomly selected small groups to talk.
When's the last time you talked to a 70-year-old white Republican?
I don't think I've ever talked to a 70-year-old white Republican. Until now.
You know, we're being stormed at the southern border, and that's a problem that needs to be dealt with.
The illegal immigrants that we have today, you can see it all of the time, waving their country's flags, burning the American flag.
Sure, on TV you see the ones that do all this crazy stuff, but most of them work.
Like the country, this group is deeply divided about immigration.
I feel like you should have a wall, a border wall.
And along comes ICE, deports them. How can we continue to do that? Not in America.
We don't want to learn your language. We don't want to follow your customs. We follow our own customs. And to me, it looks like they don't want to become Americans.
You know, Gary, your family were illegal immigrants. The American Indians, this was their country. Yeah. All of us came here, and we didn't learn their language. We didn't learn their customs. We said, you take ours, and you take it now. So we're all children of illegal immigrants. I don't know how we can be so choosy about the new ones.
That got to be a little heated in there.
It definitely did. But we've all respected one another and got to hear each other's opinions. And I never thought I would be able to relate to someone that was a Republican. And I have, more than once.
More than once.
Right.
I think it's been interesting to talk to Trump supporters because I don't meet many.
She's like, I don't want to be a part of this.
Seeing all of these people from all of these other walks of life, exactly how my views have changed on it, I'm not so hardcore.
And what is your advice about political discourse in this country?
You need to listen, not yell, not scream. You need to talk.
At the end,
And this is how your voice will be heard.
a closing poll to see if there's been any movement on the issues, but already visible.
It's opened my mind to see that I need to listen to other people's views.
Is the recognition that there is unexpected power
I really enjoyed you being here.
in bridging the divide.
I have enjoyed this beyond measure.
Okay, is that nothing further from you, Kathy, right? That was the end.
That was the end. So just to give you a flavour of the power of people from all walks of life coming together.
Great.
And where they can go.
That's it. Many thanks for that. Now, I'm going to move on and introduce our next speaker, Elena Carroll. She's joining us from Ireland. Welcome, Aileen. Tell us about the experience in Ireland.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can get this working.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about the Irish experience. I was putting up my Christmas tree last week, and I discovered I had my repeal Christmas decorations. Kind of nice to find it again. A reminder of the campaign. I'm just after finishing a research project which interviewed activists in who worked in the repeal campaign. So I thought it'd be interesting to have a look to see what they said about the citizens' assemblies. So this is Leah, who worked with the abortion rights campaign. She said, I will never say it was great. It was a stalling tactic that worked out very well for us in the end. But it was this thing that we all knew. Every pro-choice activist knew that once you give somebody the facts, they would become more pro-choice, and we saw that happening. But it was also very useful because it was what politicians pay attention to, and that ultimately is what it is for. Ooh, let me see. So on the 25th of May 2018, there was a referendum that overturned the ban on abortion that had existed since 1983. This was a campaign that lasted over 35 years, and it was a long time in the making. It's another quotation from one of the activists. This is from the group Claire from the group Terminations for Medical Reasons. Obviously, it is a fucking cowardly way about going about something, this pretending not to understand whether or not it's necessary. It worked in our favour in the end, particularly because the Citizens' Assembly ended up being so liberal in their views. And then from a group called Parents for Choice. So while originally we had been like, fuck the Citizens' Assembly, it was a pretty amazing thing to watch, to see people change their minds, and to be part of that as well was really, really cool. Parents for Choice were one of the groups that spoke at the Assembly. And the Irish Times, which is sort of the main liberal newspaper, The Guardian, I guess, said that also speaks positively of the Assembly, saying politicians are shirk dealing honestly with the abortion issue in particular for more than 4 decades, and without the Assembly's work, it is difficult to see how it would have been resolved. So I had a look at Extinction Rebellion and website, and what they argue is the use or the usefulness of the Citizens' Assembly. And that's what I'm going to use to assess the abortion assembly in Ireland. So they talk about the Assembly empowers citizens to take the lead so that politicians are less fearful of a political backlash. And everybody is heard, it's open and transparent, all the materials are openly published for the public to see. And you allow people to decide among competing expert opinions. So it's very useful when you have very complicated topics, and you can also come up with useful solutions. Assembly in Ireland, where did it come from? Well, there was an election just before the referendum in 2016. And while all the smaller left-wing parties and the Green Party said they would call for a referendum, Fine Gael, a neoliberal party who actually ended up going into power, opted for calling a Citizens' Assembly instead. So many people saw the Citizens' Assembly as a step backward, as a delay tactic, a tactic to avoid actually going straight to call a referendum. So the Citizens' Assembly, as you mentioned earlier, it listens, discuss, vote, and perhaps the most interesting part of the whole Citizens' Assembly is the process itself. You had 100 citizens meeting over 5 weekends. You had 12,000 public submissions. Many of those were some of them were only a sentence long, a paragraph long. 25 experts spoke to the Assembly. They were mostly lawyers, doctors, academics, service providers, people who provide abortion service in other countries, and people who were in the Irish Health Service. It didn't allow unanimous presentations from women who had abortions. So in all those people who spoke, you only heard the voice of women who had of 6 women who had abortions, and they spoke for about 7 minutes each. So you had 42 minutes in all the time. They didn't. The experts who were invited to speak were nominated by a steering group, an expert advisory group. So they didn't invite the Abortion Rights Campaign, which is probably the largest activist group that was working on the issue, that organised an annual March for Choice since 2012, and that march should be growing annually. When I talked to ARC activists afterwards, they said they felt they were ignored because they were seen as not being professional. They weren't salaried employees, they were all volunteers, and so they were not taken seriously. They were seen as not grown up, even though most of them were in their 20s and 30s, and many families of their own. I think that's something we should pay attention to and listen to. Terminations for Medical Reasons, another activist group, was not allowed to talk, even though ultimately they, along with the Abortion Rights Campaign, played a major part in the referendum campaign. So the advocacy groups that did speak were Parents for Choice, and they ended up really being a stand-in for all the other activist groups, and some pro-life groups, and the Irish Family Planning Association. So in who participated in the Assembly, the participants were chosen by an expert advisory group, and they leaned heavily towards professionals, whether they're academics, lawyers, doctors, or people who are working for NGOs or health service providers. So they listened to these people, they discussed it among themselves, and then they had a vote. Who chose the questions? Well, the questions were chosen by the initial parliamentary motion and the steering group. And the Assembly was able to alter the wording of some questions, but that was where they were limited to. Again, that's quite important, and we're going to return to it at the end. There was 6 ballots on various aspects of the issue. There was a number of questions on the best way to deal with the issue. Should there be legislation? There should be a repeal of the clause in the referendum? Should be repealed and replaced? The sort of kind of technical legal issues. And then there were a number of questions on what the abortion legislation, if we did introduce abortion legislation, should cover. And so they were asked to cover things like time periods, things about, should we have a woman's risk to health? What about the threat of suicide? What about in rape? What about in incest? And when they looked at those questions, 99% of the Assembly members believed in abortion when there was a threat to health, and 64% believed that there should be no restrictions in the availability of abortion. So the Assembly recommendations ended up being much more progressive than any of the recommendations that had been proposed by even the left-wing political parties. A few years earlier, some of the left-wing Labour parties had introduced a new law which still decriminalised abortion with the threat of 14 years jail. So the citizens did come up with more progressive findings, but it really has to be noted that those findings were also reflected in opinion polls that had been had over the last 30 years that showed a wide liberalisation of abortion attitudes to abortion. What happened after the Assembly? Well, then you had a parliamentary committee, the old way of doing things. At the parliamentary committee, the pro-life voice was much stronger than at the Assembly. They had much more pro-life members. They got much more pro-life airtime. The committee rejected the recommendations of allowing access of some of the Assembly's recommendations. They rejected the recommendation to allow access in the case of significant fetal abnormality. On the base, they rejected allowing abortion on the basis of socio-economic reasons, and they rejected access without restriction up to 22 weeks of gestation. So the parliamentary committee was more restricted to the Citizens' Assembly, but they did also, like the Citizens' Assembly, recommend a referendum. And 1 month later, our Prime Minister announced that we would have one. In advance of the referendum, the legislation was published, which outlined how abortion would be provided if the legislation was passed. This is a strategy or practice that has been developed since previous referendums, so that you're not just voting on a yes/no question, you also know how the legislation will be implemented. This legislation, following the parliamentary committee advice, was more restricted than the Assembly. So the key thing about this Assembly is this Assembly could make recommendations, but those recommendations could be ignored. So the actual process of it and the discussion itself was quite interesting, and I have some links, and I'll give you the slides later if you're interested. You can go online and you can have a look at the debates that were had. So was the Assembly necessary in order to have a referendum? And the answer is absolutely no. We'd actually had 5 referendums before the one in 2018. The one in 1983 and 2002 were called for following pressure by pro-life activists. And the one in 1992 was called following a tragic case and public demonstrations in response to that case. So you couldn't say that we needed an Assembly to have a referendum. We'd had referendums before. You could maybe argue that the Assembly produced a better referendum. I'm going to come back to it. So do citizens' assemblies bring about change? Now, there's an awful lot of people looking at the Irish experience and the Irish example of the abortion referendum, but that's not the only citizens' assembly we've had. We've actually had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 citizens' assemblies. So it's kind of like, why would you, Extinction Rebellion, focus on the abortion one and not on the climate change one? It's sort of picking the assembly that gives you the answer you want rather than looking at them all together. So I think rather than looking at the abortion assembly as an example of positive outcomes, don't we look at the other ones that actually were example of failed change processes? The abortion referendum was different. So what was it that made it different? What was different about the Citizens' Assembly on abortion? Well, firstly, and I think this is key important, is that there was a significant large-scale social movement in existence for decades before the Citizens' Assembly was called. And they were the people who ultimately fought the abortion referendum. You had in other assemblies where you had, for example, you had one that resulted in referendums. You had one that was looking at the Constitution, and it was interested in reducing the age of presidential candidates, and it went to referendum. No one campaigned on the issue. There was no debate, and it was rejected. So in the absence of a social movement behind the assembly has very little impact. So the second thing is that the Citizens' Assembly on abortion had pretty limited cost impacts. There are some implications in providing abortion. Abortion is available free in Ireland, but they're not excessive. The Citizens' Assembly did actually have other recommendations that were ignored, and they did have cost impacts. So they said they should have improved access to reproductive healthcare services. Women should have the access to the same standard of scanning and testing no matter where they are. They were all ignored. You had others in other assemblies with significant cost impact would be the one on aging, in which 78% of the people in the assembly said you should increase public resources allocated for the care of older people. 77 said you should enhance state support for family carers. Neither of these things have happened. And in fact, the COVID crisis has really highlighted how poorly older people are looked after in Ireland. So the difference about the abortion one is that there was no real economic actors who were lining up to argue against the change that the Assembly was proposing. There was also significant...
You've a couple more minutes.
Okay. There was also significant international pressure at the time. Ireland had broken the European Convention on Human Rights. Savita Halpiner died in 2012. And in many ways, abortion is a fairly straightforward issue to discuss. It's a stigmatized issue, and it's a complicated issue in the way that people's lives are complicated. But there are a finite and fairly well-known list of possible options, and those are the options that people voted at. So I'm just going to go back to the XR arguments why we should have it. And I'm going to go in reverse order this time. So the first one is everybody's heard all the materials openly published for the public to see. On the plus side, yes, that is true if the state puts in the resources to archiving it. And some of the information from the previous assemblies are a little bit hard to find. On the negative side, the public doesn't pay attention. The Repeal the 8 debates on the YouTube had 1,000 views. In contrast, a video called Strike for Repeal on YouTube had 4.k views of the video, and a video of a protest at 6.2k. It's covered in the newspaper, it's covered in the RT, in the news, but it isn't, I don't feel anyway, that there's very much evidence that it's really contributing to a national debate. The most recent Citizen Assemblies on gender equality, I just looked at it, many people had looked to the submission on low paid workers, 34 views. So yes, material is openly published for the public to see, doesn't mean the public wants to look at it. Next. Oops. The Citizen Assembly is useful to deciding among competing expert opinion. Yes, it can possibly do that. It could propose more progressive politics than that would have been proposed by politicians. And that's what happened in the Citizen Assembly on abortion. But on the other hand, the solutions can be ignored, which is also what happened on the Citizens' Assembly on abortion with some of the issues. And secondly, I think it's like the abortion example was ended up being quite positive, but fundamentally, you have no influence over who the experts are, and you have no influence over what the questions are. And we have experience in other Irish abortion referendums when a referendum question has been set, which both sides, the pro-life side and the pro-choice side, call for the same vote because of the way the question has been set. So you've got very little control over the framework of the discussion. So yes, it can come up with more progressive policies, but if the experts presenting are different, it could have a very different outcome. And finally, and this really is the most important one, it empowers citizens to take the lead so that politicians are less fearful of political backlash. And I think the thing I'm probably most opposed to is the empower citizens to take the lead. Don't think there's much evidence to that. It can be said, and this is the main argument people make for the Citizens' Assembly, ultimately, is that it gives politicians a cover for taking decisions that they might be afraid or unpopular. And in fact, the Irish Prime Minister, on Taoiseach, when he announced the referendum, he said, I want to thank the Citizens' Assembly for the work they did to bring us to this point. It was invaluable. So he acknowledged that the Citizens' Assembly was really important to him. That's good. But on the other hand, when it actually came to the referendum campaign, the Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, was conspicuously absent. And while his party member, the Minister of Health, did take very visible part in the politician, the grassroots members of their political party did not. So the party and the Prime Minister kind of stood on the fence waiting to see which way the wind would blow. What else is it good for? It can be a focus for activists, and the Parents for Choice who talked very positively about how they came together, how important, they developed their presentation, they worked together and they produced it, and how it was a very empowering for them to do that. It can be a moral boost for campaigners. The pro-choice campaigners did get a boost when the Citizens' Assembly were essentially mirroring the things that they've been saying over the previous 5 years. So when you have a Citizens' Assembly coming out saying things that you've been saying for a long time, that definitely gives you a lift. I think it also can be transformative for the people who are in the room taking part of it. I haven't seen any research in that, but I've heard anecdotally that people have said that it is transformative for them. I'm not quite sure. I thought we'd have to look into it. The costs, where are the costs? It can be used to downplay the importance of social movements and of activist groups. And that's happened in the repeal referendum, because the story of the repeal referendum that people are telling now, particularly politicians, is that repeal happened and the Citizens' Assembly was a crucial point in that journey. The fact that activist groups weren't allowed to invited to speak, I think, also shows that how social movements are download. As a tactic, it really prioritizes NGO groups and professional organizations, and it can do that at the expense of building grassroots power. Politicians praise assemblies, and they willfully ignore the years of protests and organizing because it doesn't suit their narrative. Empowering citizens. Well, after being involved in an assembly, the members aren't involved in any further action. The referendum was fought by the abortion rights campaign, who've been campaigning and building capacity since 2012. It was those people who actually went out and, on the doors and made the arguments. As we said before, recommendations can be ignored, and they are ignored. And then, as we said, we were worried that it would be used as a delay tactic. In the abortion referendum, because the assembly was so positive, it wasn't used as a delay tactic for very long. But it could have been if the arguments that came out in the end had been more ambiguous. I could have seen that you would have ended up with another report. So overall, I'm pretty ambiguous. I think of all the things that happened in the abortion referendum, the Citizens' Assembly is arguably, to me, one of the least interesting ones. I think it's strange that XR are focusing on it. I think when they say it empowers citizens, that's correct. That's incorrect. They could say that, it gives cover for politicians. It makes politicians less fearful of political backlash. You can have an argument there, but I don't think there's anything in the way it actually happens to show that it empowers any more than the 100 people who take part in the room. So yeah, I hope I've been even-handed and giving both sides of the argument, and I'd be really interested in hearing what other people feel about the issue.
Okay,
before I go, I just want to say the project I finished has all the interviews with the activists, and and our project reports are available online in an archive. So if anybody's interested, I really encourage you just to go and listen to their people's voices.
Right. Okay. Look, thanks.